Yankee Stadium, one of the world's most influential psychologists was greeted with a wall of booing and protest. He wasn't a politician. He hadn't said anything offensive the night before. He had simply written a book. A book that argued, with decades of data behind it, that smartphones were making young people miserable, and the crowd, mostly young people, rejected it. Not with counter-arguments, with noise. Now ask yourself something. What does it mean when the generation that suffers the most is also the generation most hostile to understanding why? We are living through what psychologists are beginning to call the most rapid deterioration of adolescent mental health ever recorded. Since around 2012, rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and loneliness among teenagers have climbed with an almost mechanical consistency, not just in one country, across the English-speaking world, across Europe, across nations with wildly different cultures, economies, and histories. Something changed. Something that crossed borders without a passport. And by 2026, that something has matured into what researchers are now calling the satisfaction engine era, the age in which every major platform runs on a feedback loop engineered to be as emotionally sticky as possible. Your phone does not show you what's true. It shows you what keeps you from putting it down. And here is where the dilemma deepens, because the people most affected by this, Gen Z, the anxious generation, are not passive victims who don't know what's happening. They know. They've heard the warnings. They scroll past the articles about doom scrolling. And yet, the engagement numbers go up. The loneliness numbers go up. The clinical diagnoses go up. This is not a story about ignorance. This is a story about something far more unsettling, a trap that is visible and inescapable, or so it feels. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist at NYU, and his central argument in The Anxious Generation is not that phones are evil, it's something stranger. He argues that we have accidentally replaced the developmental environment that shaped human childhood for hundreds of thousands of years with something the human brain was never built to process. Think about what childhood used to be: boredom, scraped knees, unsupervised afternoons, conflict with other children that had to be resolved without an adult stepping in, failure that stung and then faded. Haidt calls this free play, and he considers it not a luxury, but a biological necessity. The psychological immune system doesn't develop in a sterile environment. It develops through exposure to low-stakes pain. Now here is the high-contrast metaphor I want you to hold. Imagine a child who is raised in a glass house. Perfect temperature, no rain, no insects, no accidental bruises. They grow up technically healthy, no scars, no infections, but their skin, having never adapted to the elements, becomes extraordinarily thin. And then one day, the glass breaks. Not from anything catastrophic, just ordinary life. Haidt argues this is what smartphones and hyperprotective parenting, acting together, reinforcing each other, have done to an entire generation. Not weakened their minds, thinned their skin. But Haidt is only one angle on this, because there is a philosopher who saw this pattern coming, not in teenagers, not in smartphones, but in the structure of modern consciousness itself. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 1880s, described something he called ressentiment, a French word for a very precise psychological phenomenon. Ressentiment is not ordinary anger. It is the anger of someone who feels powerless to act, who cannot change their circumstances, and so turns the energy inward. It festers. It reframes. It does not say, "I am weak." It says, "The world that made me weak is evil." Nietzsche saw ressentiment as the defining pathology of people who had been denied the experience of genuine struggle, and he was not unsympathetic. He understood it as a coping mechanism, a story the psyche tells itself to survive. Now hold both of these ideas at once. Haidt's glass house, Nietzsche's ressentiment. A generation raised in unprecedented comfort and safety, a generation with thin skin. A generation that has been handed every intellectual tool to understand their suffering, and yet, confronted with that understanding at Yankee Stadium, responds with noise. Is that irrationality, or is it ressentiment? Is it denial, or is it the predictable output of a psyche that has been structurally denied the experience of sitting with discomfort long enough to metabolize it? Here is the inversion. Everything we have said so far sounds like a diagnosis of doom, a generation wired for anxiety, a philosopher who predicted the trap, an algorithm engineered to keep the trap closed. But there is something Haidt says, quietly, almost in passing, that most people miss. The brain is not fixed. Neuroplasticity is not a self-help buzzword. It is a biological fact. The same capacity that allowed the social media environment to reshape how young people process emotion, status, and threat is the same capacity that can reshape it back. And Nietzsche, the philosopher most famous for darkness, spent the last coherent years of his life writing about something he called amor fati, love of fate. Not acceptance of suffering, love of it. He wasn't prescribing masochism, he was pointing at something precise, that a life which cannot include its own pain, which requires the deletion of everything uncomfortable, is a life lived at half volume. The twist is this. The anxious generation is not uniquely broken. It is uniquely aware. No previous generation had this level of access to the language of psychology, to the vocabulary of trauma, to the frameworks of mental health. The problem is not that they lack tools. The problem is that tools without resistance produce nothing. You cannot build strength by describing a weight. And this is where the inversion becomes genuinely liberating. Because if the trap is made of comfort, then discomfort is the key. Not manufactured suffering, not suffering for its own sake, but the quiet, deliberate choice to sit inside difficulty long enough for something to change. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, general, and the Stoic philosopher, least interested in being famous for philosophy, wrote his meditations as a private notebook. They were never meant to be published. They were written to himself as reminders. Not because he had solved the problem of suffering, but because he knew, empirically, that the mind forgets what it has already learned. And so he wrote it down again and again. One of his reminders was this: you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. What strikes me about that sentence in 2026 is not the first half, it's the second. Realize this, not think it, not agree with it intellectually, not share a post about it. Realize it, to make it real, through repeated contact with it. The Stoics believed that wisdom was not a destination, it was a practice. A daily renegotiation with the fact that the world does not owe you ease. And the Zen tradition, radically different in its origin, remarkably similar in its conclusion, would add only this: you don't need to fix the anxious mind. You need to stop trying to escape it. Because the mind that is running from anxiety cannot see clearly, but the mind that turns toward it, that sits with it, that asks it honest questions, that mind begins to discover something. Not peace as the absence of discomfort, but something older, steadier. Something that was there before the glass broke. At Yankee Stadium, a psychologist was booed. And somewhere in that crowd, someone was listening. Not because they agreed, but because something in them recognized the truth of it and chose, for a moment, against the noise, to sit with the discomfort of that recognition. That moment, small, silent, invisible, is not a solution, but it is a beginning. It has always been enough to begin.